Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Autistic Tidbits and Tangents podcast. We are today talking about neuroplurality in the workplace, and we have as a guest with us today, Mekki MacAulay, and we're going to get to an introduction in just a little bit. For now, my name is Maya Todale. I'm an autistic psychologist from Denmark, and this is my co-host, Kara Diamond.
I'm an autistic teacher from Canada. And with us today, as we mentioned, we have Mekki MacAulay, who is the IBM CIO, Red Hat OpenShift, and IBM Z Mainframe strategy guy. That's a mouthful, who specializes in modern open source strategies for technology companies. He holds a PhD in strategic management from the Schulich School of Business in Toronto, my home city, and is a professional engineer registered in Ontario. He's also a member of the Neurodiversity at IBM community that focuses on improving workplaces for autistic and other neurodivergent folks to have fulfilling and successful careers at IBM and in other like-minded organizations. He has authored several essays on the topic of Neuroplural Enterprises, how companies can get and maintain a competitive advantage by leveraging neurodiversity at all levels of the organization hierarchy, especially executive leadership. And he enjoys teaching, cycling, video games, martial arts, and comic books, and is a prolific ailurophile, which we will talk about later.
We'll absolutely get into that. So obviously, we're going to be just talking as we normally do. This is tidbits and tangents, so get ready for the tangents. And yeah, for now, let's just roll the intro. Welcome to Autistic Tidbits and Tangents.
Candid conversations between autistic off-hour professionals.
Cool. Trigger warnings for this episode include discussions of stigma, ableism, and one cursey word.
I think a couple of cursey words.
Maybe.
All right, Mekki, what is neuroplurality?
Neuroplurality was the brainchild of a shower one day when I was frustrated with the term neurodiversity and what I saw as organizations doing the bare minimum. It's no surprise to your audience that organizations think of diversity in general, but also neurodiversity more as a marketing exercise. Hey, look at us. We really want to support these people. And it's these people. It's not us. It's not integral to the organization. And I thought about what an organization would look like if it had the distribution of neurodivergent people that created the most value for the organization. Because my specialty is business, I always think about value. And there's been Harvard Business Review articles about the value of neurodiversity, not as let's give those poor people jobs, entry level, we pat them on the head, good, you can do a little task, but rather what's known as the strength-based approach, which is these people can do certain things exceptionally, usually, and it's not always the savant stories we hear about of instant memory or numerical calculations, but it is often, and this has been empirically measured, above their neurotypical peers along those dimensions. So I thought about it and I'm like, why aren't organizations structuring themselves deliberately at all layers of the organization to tap into those strengths? And that's where the idea of that's not diversity, that's a certain deliberateness And plurality seemed to fit more about the idea of it's not just, well, we want to target some number and okay, we've got those entry level people, but rather at every single level of the organization, we are putting people where their strengths shine, and it's good for the organization. And I didn't feel that neurodiversity as a term could fully capture that. And I wanted to add the business context in the term. And that's where I coined the phrase Neuroplural Enterprises, neuroplurality, to give, sort of the very short attention span business leaders who read the title of a book on the shelf in the business section, Neuroplural Enterprises. What's that? Subtitle, How to Get a Competitive Advantage from Neurodiversity in Your Organization Constructed Deliberately. Oh, that's a cool book. Okay, I'll take that off the shelf and maybe I'll do something with that in my organization. That's where it came out. And then I got out of the shower, dripping, et cetera, and started typing on my keyboard and started a series of essays where maybe those can eventually make the structure of that book. And I started with talking about what's the current situation. What does it look like, this hypocrisy I was talking about? And then I talked about some of the different pros and cons in different pieces of the essay. And most recently, I put up one looking more at the strength side and how it turns into competitive advantage, specifically because we know the mechanisms of how it works. And unsurprisingly, most of it, it turns out, is good for your neurotypical employees too. A lot of it is just, hey, let your employees play to their strengths, right? But it's not taken as a given for a lot of reasons because organizations get stuck in how they do things. And so that's the initial tangent.
I'm going to go off on another tangent based on what you said. So I'm always so torn about anything that's like capitalistic, neoliberalism, but we are always having to define ourselves in terms of value. What value do we bring to others? And I hate that, but it's like we also, in business, we have to make that neoliberal argument that we have things to offer. I wish we didn't. I wish it was just everyone has something to offer, which is what I see in neuroplurality. The potential is there for everyone to bring what they can to the team. There wasn't really a follow-up. I was just going to rant about neoliberalism for a while.
It comes from that urge, as an autistic individual myself, when I was learning how to make friends, which we just take as given that children know how to do. My mind always was, well, how can I be useful to that person? Then they'll want to be my friend. And we see this talked about in autistic communities, that our love language can be, I want to help you solve your problems. Yes. Well, my love language to my company can be, I want my company to succeed. Why do we take that as something strange? Why don't we champion that? And more importantly, the point that I was going to leave later, but tidbits and tangents, I can't wait. The real issue for me is at the most senior levels of the organization. We still have this, I don't want to steal the term glass ceiling because it's been used more in feminist presentation. Maybe I have to come up with another shower term for that. But we still see that there's a certain ceiling where, yes, but you can't be trusted, or if I put you in front of a client, it's a risk, but you're not one of us. So let me give you an example. I interviewed for a very senior strategy role. I have a PhD in strategy. I have a PhD in open source strategy, and IBM's the largest open source company in the world. And the strategy people said to me, well-intendedly, and this is not an attack on IBM because every company did this, yes, but you don't look like the average person from Boston Consulting Group. And I bet if you went and look at the average presentation of neuro representation in Boston Consulting Group, you would see a much lower level of autistic presentation and these other things because it's a form of modern old boys club, if you will. Every single one of them was in a frat or sorority. If you go and look on their LinkedIn pages, it's fascinating.
Absolutely. No, it's this culture that there is, but honestly, I think there's a lot of undiagnosed autistic people
in these fields.
Well, in the whole business world, like Kara and I keep saying, we're everywhere. And actually, my boss and her late brother, they kind of they had this question, because obviously if you're a CEO somewhere, or maybe you're a CIO or a CFO, and you don't want to get an official autism diagnosis because
the labeling stigma.
There's a huge stigma. And so what they did was like, okay, let's take the autism test and kind of tweak it, and we'll call it systemizer.
Oh, I love it.
And
I've not heard of that. Interesting.
No, it's only in Denmark, as I know right now, but they are working on, I think there's a team working on translating it. But what was really interesting was they pitch it more as a kind of personality profile, kind of, this is just your way of working. And obviously it kind of takes root in the unfortunate systemizer versus empathizer thing.
Baron Cohen.
But we don't really use that. The cool thing about the test, as I see it, is that they've taken basically the AQ test, the autism quotient. They've added some questions, and now what it does is it gives you an entire profile divided into 9 different subsections, so that you can go in and talk about what is difficult for you in the workplace and where are your strengths.
Okay, so you're writing a chapter in my book, because that's perfect. Here's your starting point, managers.
I'll set you up with my boss then, because she'll definitely want to get involved with this, I think. No, but I think it's so important, because if we can start to kind of address how many undiagnosed autistics are out there in the business world, let's start by calling it systemizer, call it whatever, I don't care, but call it something, and start getting people to think about how they actually work, what environment works for them. And
what doesn't. So much we discovered with the pandemic. Yeah. I am 1,000 times more productive at home. If I have to, oh my God, I'm so much more productive. But it's almost offensive to some people that I'm more productive at home. And so they need to find a way to undermine that. But then they look at all the metrics and they're like, shit, you really are. And I'm like, yeah, because you don't drag me into this awkward place and, have to do all these interactions and constant distractions. And I can just do my, sorry, I interrupted, but like you're nailing it. You're nailing it.
That's so important though.
Yeah,
it is. And I see that with several of the autistic people I know that, I know a couple of people who work in IT and things like that, and they just work better when they can sit in a quiet space and work on their coding. And when you put us in, for example, an open office environment, we're going to crash.
Terrible.
We're just going to crash.
Terrible. Yeah. Overstimulation and just constant. Oh, it's too much. Yeah.
Yeah.
Just thinking about undiagnosed in workplaces. So I have observed many teachers, obviously in my profession, who I think are undiagnosed. And there's something, if you don't know that you are autistic, sometimes we can reinforce the norms. We can act sort of in an oppressive way, because it's like, well, this is how it's supposed to be. This is how it's supposed to work in the workplace. Do you see that at all? Like in a field? Yeah.
100%. We see people who, and again, I get stuck on the leadership executive topic. We see people who got there for the wrong reasons, so try to get other people to do the wrong things to do it as well. And it's really unfortunate, because it's ultimately bad for the organization. It's acting in a role to try and pretend to be something that we aren't, that doesn't benefit anybody. So if we could just acknowledge that, hey, difference isn't always bad. And hey, look, this difference is good for everybody, even if it isn't the norm. Why can't that be enough? Well, because it wasn't safe for the boomer generation.
Yes.
That's why, right? It really comes back to that. And they still control a lot of the norms in organizations.
But also, I think if you're in a culture that is actually unhealthy or that doesn't work for people, but you are either diagnosed or undiagnosed autistic, I think either can kind of contribute in various ways. Maybe you're afraid to actually step into that role of saying, no, we have to change this culture.
100%.
Because if you're diagnosed autistic, people are going to point at you and say, yeah, but you're autistic. You don't speak for the rest of us.
Yes.
And if you're undiagnosed autistic, it's very likely that you've grown up with, always being the one that's socially wrong. And so taking on that role and stepping forward and saying, we need to make some changes is scary, even if you're in a position of authority.
Totally. When I was first part of the Neurodiversity at IBM community, I was very self-aware about the fact that I'm not formally diagnosed. I score way up on the actual quotients, but I've never gotten the formal diagnosis. And I said to the community, and I said, look, guys, I don't want to take on the mantle and, take advantage of it. What's going on? They said, oh my God, and pointed me to the literature about how more than 50% of people are undiagnosed. And they actually said something that shocked me. They said, you present and speak surprisingly well. We want you to do that for us. Please represent us, because that seems to be one of your strengths that a lot of us don't have. So no, please call yourself autistic, represent our community. And so I felt a lot better about that. That's something that I spent decades working on. When I was much younger, I was a terrible public speaker, but I spent a lot of deliberate, focused time training on that. And like anything else, it's a muscle you can build, but not everybody was comfortable with that. So I played to my strengths, and that's why I talk very openly about autism, because I have that strength. Allow me to showcase for those who don't have that strength.
Now, okay, ideal world. Okay, if you are the head of an organization, how are you making it comfortable for everyone?
Oh, goodness.
I start with the easy ones, right?
Oh, yeah, the easy ones. Step one is taking stock. You have to see what's going on. And I talk about this in one of my articles. One of the mistakes that companies make a lot is known as Goodhart's Law. And Goodhart's Law, summarized roughly, is once you are trying to achieve a given metric, the metric itself ceases to have value. It's no longer representing whatever it was measuring, because you're working to it, not to the underlying thing. And companies are terrible for this. The same is true with employment equity, with diversity, with anything else. They say, I want a goal of X number of people, and then the number becomes the goal rather than neuroplurality, which is why I want to put that in. So you have to take stock and you have to count, but you have to be very careful to not make the counting the goal, not make the matching certain numbers the goal. When you take stock, you then have to look at the systemic barriers that exist between the layers in the organization and start to tackle them. And I say start because these elements are really, really hard to change. And it has to be top down and bottom up. Definitely need executive leadership, but you also need a bottom up desire to do that. And sometimes side investors or whatever. We now see investors having more pressure in these spaces. To make that happen. And it has to be tied to something tangible. And that's why, while I 100% agree that I don't like that we have to make ourselves have value, it's an easy one. It's a bit of a cheat that we can say, well, look, value can be quantified in a lot of ways. Let's do that, even though maybe it's not the right thing. And the bait and switch will be, okay, now that we have value, now, hey, look, we were human all along. That's the bait and switch. You start with the wrong thing and then come back and say, right? So again, how am I doing this? And I'm still staying very high level. The systemic barriers that I'm talking about are going to end up looking like the systemic barriers for any underrepresented group or for any group whose specific talents are not being put to best use. And all of these things are best practices for organizations to begin with. what I see is a lot of navel gazing and blinders across all levels of all major organizations. And maybe it's because I'm an academic and I'm used to thinking in terms of factors and research and all of these things. But the divide between research and practice is like, it's like, it wraps around, because it's not just we don't want to do the things that research says we've done. We're offended by the idea that you would ever tell us anything to do. Yeah. It's, like we've seen in the COVID epidemic, I would literally rather die than you tell me to put a piece of cloth over my face. That's how managers behave in organizations. It's human
hubris and
digging and hubris, I suppose. But it's so human that's why it's so difficult to tackle.
But as you were already talking about, like, it's the same barriers that any other underrepresented 100%. Group has to go through. And I think, when we look at the barriers that women had to go through to get into the workplace, and we're still not done with that, especially in certain areas, certain fields.
We still do 10 white men panels on how to hire women. We still do that.
we still do hire black people, right?
Well, exactly.
Right? White on the panel.
Yeah.
And again, it's the same with, non-straight people of all stripes, and gender identities, and people of color. And, now we're trying to also jump through the same hoops and go through the same march with, neuroplurality. And I think there's an extra barrier for us, because as you were talking about earlier, not all of us are comfortable speaking. Not all of us have those voices. And I think the number of us that do is probably lower.
Probably. And this isn't even touching the intersectionality, the overlap, right? No. I have a lot of privilege by virtue of being a cis, straight, white, passing male. I want to put that privilege to good use to help this community. But then you're talking about gender identity. Well, there's tons of overlap between gender identity and autistic folk. Huge. Yeah. It's something like 350% more likely to have gender dysmorphia. And we have anxiety overlap, OCD overlap, ADHD overlap, PTSD overlap. And so depression, we have to be very careful. As we know in the psychology literature, the DSM was created in a way that at the time made sense. And even in the DSM-5, we moved it up, but it still comes from a fundamental perspective of mental illness is defined as what's not the norm. That's the precursor to the DSM. And so the same behavior and presentation in one society can be literally mental illness, but not in another society. Yeah. And this is the thing that people have trouble with the DSM, because they think labels are uniform. So
that's true. But also I think people view diagnoses from the wrong perspective. Totally. So one of the things that that we talk about in psychology circles, and certainly also in psychiatry circles, but perhaps not to the same degree, which it should be, is that a diagnosis isn't a label to say this is something that fits the person. It's to say that enough of this fits the person that it makes sense to put this label here to give them access to the support that they might otherwise not have access to.
Totally.
So
labels are gatekeepers, and they are a framework for, a sort of starting hypothesis of what might be hard for you or easy for you.
In an ideal world, you wouldn't have to have the diagnosis to get the support. You would just have a description.
I was about to say that. Exactly. Yeah.
And you actually said something earlier about a lot of the changes that you might want to make in the workplace. They apply to everyone else. It's not a neurodiversity thing. It's not an autism thing. It's just people work better if they are accommodated in all their differences.
Exactly.
And Kara and I have talked about this with kids as well in school. Like, why do we have to have the diagnosis?
Torture for me.
It is torture.
Torture. I've described schools as literal prisons to people, and they say, "What do you mean?" And I start mapping out the power and dynamic and control structures of prisons and schools, and then they go, "Oh shit, they are literal prisons," and I'm like, "Yes,
yeah."
Like right down to you have no human rights. Like actually, it's crazy. Yeah.
And again, with differences from country to country.
True.
But if we
Denmark does better on that. I like Denmark.
I mean, I don't actually remember when we outlawed corporal punishment in schools.
They still have it in the States, in a lot of states.
Well, and Canada is debating it right now for parental corporate punishment, and
really?
There's is
that still legal there?
Yes, but the problem is, and there's a good debate about this. The concern is that if we make it illegal, the forces that be are going to disproportionately target disenfranchised communities and are going to use this as an excuse to take more Native children away from Native families, which is a historical trauma in Canada. So there are actually really good debates about whether the law, the giant hammer that it is the best way to address that.
Yeah.
But there is still a lot in the trash publications which determine our elections. I was fine when I got beaten as a child. So, well, if you're saying that, no, you're not fine, but people don't get that.
You're actually not fine.
No, exactly.
Does show that.
Yeah. And it's worse for autistic children. We always hear in communities being forced to make eye contact as a child, and these social rules about you're not paying attention to me if you're not making eye contact. And I wasn't as bad with that, but lots of my peers, it's literally the opposite. If I'm making eye contact, the overwhelmingness of the visual stimulation turns off my auditory sense. That's how they've described it. And it's literally the opposite, that I have to not look at you to listen to you, but literally beaten into doing that. And then the secondary punishment of, well, you didn't listen to what I say. Well, you forced me to listen a particular way. We do this to autistic children still today, and it's very sad.
We do. And I think that it keeps applying all the way up into the workplace and all the way through our lives. It's if you don't communicate in this very stereotypical, neurotypical way, then, and it's weird to say stereotypical and neurotypical in the same sentence, but it is.
I'm taking something off my wall here because it's very relevant. Behind my camera, which, by the way, this is how I'm at work all day, every day. This is how I meet clients, how I meet my colleagues. Directly behind my camera, I have this.
Okay.
And this is a personal reminder to turn on my acting.
Yeah.
When my camera turns on.
It is a film slate, just for anyone.
It is a film slate to say, okay, Mekki, you're now on camera. Behave like a neurotypical.
Turn it on. Yeah.
Turn it on and make sure that you don't do or say anything that throws anybody off, that makes them uncomfortable, or there will be severe consequences in the workplace. I actually had this commissioned and made to put on my wall so that I could do that specifically for my professional development. And here's the real kicker. Every single one of my mentors said that's a good thing and you should keep doing that. We encourage people to act to avoid the consequences because it is so profoundly inappropriate in society to be different in any way.
Yeah, it is.
I often, if I have if I'm presenting at a conference or providing professional development to a small group, I deliberately, I have outfits that I put on. I'm like, this is professional care. I put on your glasses, exactly. I wear it like a role,
Yeah. Literally. And my wife will overhear my conversation sometime and she'll be like, oh, that guy you were just meeting with was super neurotypical, wasn't he? And I'm like, yep. She's like, I could tell because you put on that role for him and you were making jokes about sports. And I know you don't give a shit about sports. And she knows my personas that I have deliberately. And and again, this is something that we teach everybody in sort of, what's the word? It's one of these psychology principles about negotiation and synchronizing with the person you're talking with. What's different is that it's more instinctive, not learned scripted for neurotypical people. For autistic people, we create these scripts and we learn to follow these scripts. So for me, it's very scripted.
And the stakes are higher, right? Like, I think neurotypicals know when to turn it on and turn it off, like you said, very instinctually. And for us, it's like, it could be our whole day.
Yeah.
To paraphrase Chris Bonello, sorry, go ahead.
They can still be nervous, I think, about, putting on their persona costume for, say, a job interview or something like that. But for us, it's all day, every day.
Yeah. Yep. To paraphrase Chris Bonello from Autistic Not Weird online, who maintains, he said, what's unique about the autistic communication experience is that if you misunderstand us, it's our fault. If we misunderstand you, it's also our fault. And that's something that is not applied to neurotypical people. And what actually happens, if you look at the research, it's that neurotypical people communicating falsely believe that they understand each other. They actually don't, but they pretend they do to the point that they actually believe they do. And that miscommunication is discarded in the social rules.
They're all emperor new closing it? Like
literally, yes. It's fascinating. And so I get one of my dear, dear, dear friends was known as Question Boy in university. He's off the scale autistic, undiagnosed, doesn't realize it. I asked him one time, hey, why don't you take this metric? He's like, why? I'm not autistic. And I'm like,
are you though?
And he took the metric and he's like, I figured I had traits, but I didn't realize I was off the scale. Weird. In university, he was called Question Boy, not as a compliment, because he was the guy that when the professor said something that was inconsistent, contradictory, and whatever, he'd always be like, but shouldn't that be this? To the point that the entire engineering class got frustrated at him for asking too many questions. We shared all the classes together. I personally witnessed his questions. They were always logical, consistent, directly related to what was being talked about. And he graduated top 5 of our entire graduating class because he knew his stuff as a result. And yet the entire community of engineers who are already predisposed to be more ones of us still labeled him with a toxic label just for seeking clarification. That's how punished it is.
Yeah.
He went to Google for 10 years and then got dropped in the latest layoffs and for no reason of his own. Very sad.
And the literature shows that as well, like the research around employment rates for autistics, we have the lowest employment of any disability group. And often we have the most expertise, but expertise is not enough. Expertise maybe rubs people the wrong way, It's so bizarre because to me, that should be what is valued. And yet what is valued is how do you make other people feel? Are you able to beat around?
Nailed it. Yes. How you make other people feel is the only thing that matters. Yeah. Sorry, Maya, go ahead.
I think it's also, there's a barrier to even getting employed in the first place because getting through a job interview means having to step into this room and connecting with the people there. And if social interaction is one of your primary challenges, then that's a huge hurdle to get through. But then even on the other side, if you've gotten your job, I've seen in the last 20 years, maybe even 30 years, I don't remember the last 10 years of that well, because I was a kid. But in the last 20 years, certainly I've seen that more and more of those really highly specialized jobs disappear. So when the Danish National Radio Library was digitalized, the guy whose job it was to keep track of it before obviously lost his job. He had been there his entire adult life. He knew exactly where you could find every single album, every single artist, every single song. He knew where everything was. And no one could have done that job except him. Because he knew everything. He knew which year, he had everything ordered. And then that library was digitalized, and what's he going to do?
And you lose that expertise and that human touch.
Yes.
You know?
Yes. And this hits the topic of reskilling as well. The idea that I'm going to back myself up because I'm already hitting the wall of this isn't just about autistic people. This is about everybody.
Yeah.
We have a problem in organizations that the primary criteria for determining competence for anything is, have you done it before? That is 99% of everything. And study after study after study, Harvard Business Review has said over and over and over, stop hiring for what they've done, hire for what they can do. You hire for potential, not rote memorization.
Mm-hmm.
Yet it is uniformly the only thing. And I think it's a bigger problem for autistic folk because, as you say, we can be exceptionally qualified, but maybe we didn't do that one thing. And we're not allowed to prove that we can do that one thing. We just didn't do it. There's this weird mix of, I will not even allow you to prove that you can do the thing. I will not trust that you can do the thing unless you've done it before. And it's arrogant that you say you can do it because you haven't done it. So how do you know you can do it? Well, I know, and I will show you if you let me. And I hit that barrier continuously. It's part of the neuroplurality challenge. We say, well, how can you be an executive if you haven't been an executive? Well, train you to be an executive. Oh, no. We'll hire someone from another company who's already been an executive. So we have this issue in companies that we only hire lateral moves from other places. And this disproportionately affects autistic people. My dear friend graduated top 5 of our engineering class, worked at Google for 10 years, didn't get a single promotion ever. Never. Because he was very good at the one thing he did, but he was never seen as someone with leadership potential. That's completely false. He's one of the smartest people I've ever met. But the way we measure smart and value and capable is so limited and so false, the evidence tells us. We're not willing to think beyond that. And by we, I mean people with power. And I have big tangents about the nature of power and power relationships and how neurodivergent folk are always on the low end of the power relationship and how that determines so much.
But also, when you're talking about, hiring people for what they've already done, there's nothing to show you what they've actually done well.
Thank you. The research says over and over, just because they didn't mean they do it well. You're 1,000% right. And so that's why people keep failing upwards.
And I've seen it. My husband works he works as a manager in shipping industry. And so, a bunch of people got hired. He was in a new department. And of course, they have the hiring process, and it's a huge company. So they also, put them through all these tests and everything before they even get to a job interview, But here's the thing. You can get through all of those tests and even the job interview and say, oh, I've done this and this and that before and blah, 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 blah. And then you get into the job. And what actually happened was one of the other managers, actually his boss, when he got hired, was one of those people that, it was supposed to be a senior manager position. But every single question that was posed to this person, they answered with another question. So it was like, how about this? How do we solve that problem? Well, how do you think we are going to solve that problem?
Throwing your back.
But it's your job to figure out which of these solutions is the best one. It's your job to make the decisions. You're the manager.
My goodness.
Completely incapable of doing that. And of course they were out, before their trial period was even up, but they were still capable of getting the job.
Yes.
And an autistic person who doesn't have the social qualities to convince someone that they are capable of being a leader would then not have gotten that job, even if they were qualified.
And I mean, I have such a problem with interviews that look for particular buzzwords because I think we all think in such innovative ways. I might have an answer that the panel of hiring people never anticipated, but is really, really an insightful.
Government's terrible for that. If you gave an answer that's correct, but it's not on our list, it's still false. Or because union rules or some sort of nonsense like that. Any excuse to say, huge issue.
Same in teaching.
I like this.
Yeah. And then if you know a principle, you can get the list and you know the buzzwords to say, you know?
Exactly. I like to just summarize it this way. The skill of getting the job is different from the skill of doing the job.
And keeping the job.
And keeping the job. No, well said. And keeping the job, because that is a distinct one. And it's terrible. And HR is completely broken in most companies. We hire for completely the wrong things. And what's worse, and this is an academic frustration continuously, we know how to hire for the right things. We just refuse. Just like a lot of other things. It's primarily human factors. It's not that we don't know the right way to do it. We do. We refuse. Very sad.
Do you think it's like a matter of time, more expensive? I was like, what are the, like, I go back to neoliberalism.
No, it's a matter of culture. It's primarily culture, primarily human factors. Because if you do the math, hiring people that are actually good at the job always is net better value for the company.
Of course.
Always, even if the initial process is longer. And so for the entry-level jobs for autistic people, we're starting to solve that. There's Specialist Turn that is now doing a good job of that globally, getting people prepared for that process and training the hiring managers on the other side as well. And that's great for entry level. We don't have that for the neuroplurality across the organization. So I have some very senior mentors at IBM who know I'm autistic because I talk about it openly. And I say, look, how do I work, not be handed, how do I work to an executive role? And they go, because they don't know themselves. And if you look at which executives get promoted when, it seems to be the assholes. And it's really unfortunate. It's the ones who behave the least consistently from what they say versus what they do.
Yeah.
Or who are very good at putting their name on other people's work and then getting credit for it, who seem to be the most rewarded. And if you look at research about autistic people, when you're doing a binary comparison to neurotypical people to autistic, one of the traits of autistic people is we behave ethically both when watched and when not watched. Yeah. Whereas neurotypical people behave ethically when watched, but don't necessarily when they're not watched. And that creates a huge power divide in organizations where there's this known wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Yes, we say we're doing it, but we all know we're not. That autistic people are like, but I'm doing it. And then that's secretly cast out.
I think that actually also, if I can throw in a tangent, goes towards the proportion of people with an antisocial personality disorder, the proportion of those in high power positions.
Totally. And narcissism as well. Yes.
Well, that's antisocial personality disorder as well. And in the DSM.
Oh, okay. It's a category. Got it.
Yeah. So it's with or without narcissistic traits.
Got it.
Yeah.
I just read an article yesterday that basically had children decide who they believed most, the person who spoke really well or the person who was actually the expert, and said things like, I don't know, or I'll have to get back to you. And they basically always believed the golden-tongued person.
And you've just summarized popularism in democracy right now.
Yes, exactly. It drives me up the wall. And I talk a lot actually with my friend Bruce about how as autistic people, and again, knowing we're not a monolith, so this is just a generalization that I make, we tend to be very accurate in our self-assessments. So if there's something I say I'm great at, I truly am. It's not a brag. I'm great at that. But I am also equally honest when I'm like, I am shitty at that. Like that
I borrowed that term from Dr. Gunter, who is known for the Vagina Bible. And what she does on Twitter is she debunks a lot of the Gwyneth Paltrow nonsense about the female anatomy and that you should put eggs in your vagina and all this shit that sells very well. And she wrote through, and she has a show on CBC that's about, hey, let's learn the real facts about Fiona. She's a gynecologist by trade, but has that speaking ability. And she said, in response to Twitter trolls who said, what do you know? She said, I have appropriate confidence. I am a certified gynecologist and I know what I know about gynecology. I'm not arrogant when I talk about gynecology. It's appropriate confidence. And we have this issue that any confidence is misconstrued as arrogance, regardless of whether or not it's justified. And as someone who myself presents very confident with a powerful personality, I constantly get the feedback that you come back as arrogant. You're too certain in your answers. And I'm like, well, if you asked me about open source strategy, hi, literally top 5 on the planet. So maybe it's okay if I'm confident about my answers. I literally wrote the book on it.
This is your
If you ask me about something I don't know, I will say I don't know. And the fact that I say I don't know is proof that the things that I say I do know, I have appropriate confidence about. But we ridiculously punish that. And I've been told by very senior people, hint, hint, nudge, nudge, Kara, you know who they are, that I intimidate people more senior than me. Because they are afraid that I know more than them. And therefore, they have a need to squish me because they are afraid that their employee will make them look bad by being more competent than them. And that's a thing that we do to people.
I think too about like performance reviews, how like they are actually like designed to crush people. It's not how can we as an organization support you better? It's like we have to find something to nitpick and criticize.
Yes. Or scapegoat. Let's call it what it is, scapegoat, because we do that. We do that to the people who say all along throughout the year before the performance review, hey, this is what I need. Here's what the challenges are. You know, well, whatever, just do your job. And then at the end of the performance review, well, you didn't do anything. Well, I told you what I needed and you said, yeah, whatever. So whose fault is it that I didn't do what you needed? No. That's a thing that we do. And it's very, very sad. And if you put it in a disability framework, if you ask somebody who's blind all year to do something that involves visual skills, and then you say, well, you failed at it, what's wrong with you? Or the comic strip where if you ask the monkey to fly and you ask the bird to swim and you ask the fish to run, it makes no sense. But we still make people responsible for what is pushed on them, no matter how much they try to fix it along the way.
Yeah. Also, to what you were talking about before, I think autistic people respond very well to others saying, I don't know that actually. I
compliment it now because it's so uncommon. I try to reinforce it.
I actually use it in my therapy. Like if a client asks me a question and I don't know the answer, I will tell them, I don't know. I will try to figure it out. And also like so one of the things I do a lot is I explain kind of a basic version of how stress responses work in the brain and things like that. Because I work with a lot of clients who suffer from burnout or anxiety or depression. Sometimes it's relevant to talk about brains, right? But I always tell them, I don't know this to the detailed degree that you will be able to find if you read all the research, because it's not relevant to my job to know it at that level. Yeah. It's relevant to my job that I know it at the practical level. Like, how can I explain it in a way that makes sense to the average person? And what can we do about it? Yes. That's what makes sense in the context of my job. And it would be a waste of time and resources for me to start reading all the neurological research. Yeah. I could do it if I was interested, but I don't understand.
Well, and you could do it if it was necessary, just to put it in the framework I was saying earlier. If you were in a hierarchical organization where they suddenly needed someone to be a leadership in neurology, you could absolutely learn it. And you saying, I could learn this and do this, just give me a few months, would come back and say, but you didn't do it before. So how could you know that you could do it? This is the perfect proof that it's not a lack of ability, it's a lack of necessity at a given time.
And where you want to take your own skills, right? Because as autistic people, we also have preferences for what we want to be doing.
And our brains activate and make us able to hyperfocus when we're interested, when we're engaged and challenged in the way that we like. And our brains just struggle a lot more if those
hence the overlap with ADHD and other things. Absolutely, yes.
Yes. Now, I think it's actually just about time for us to get to thing of the day. And I think we actually have two today.
Okay. You go first. You go first.
Well, so Mekki, you actually kind of started on it a little bit earlier. You mentioned it. So I'm Danish, so I go by the Danish pronunciation, which is specialisterne.
Of course.
Translated the specialists. And of course, this is a rare organization that was started by a parent of an autistic child who, was there with that entry-level problem that you talked about. Like, how do we actually get autistic people into the workplace? How do we get companies to recognize that autistic people have skills that are useful and they can actually fit into the workplace? And so what they do is they help to train autistic people in skills, like they've done a lot of programming. But they also will work with training people at the workplace to understand autism better and make some accommodations. So it sounds like you have a little bit of experience with them.
Yes, I tried and failed to hire 15 engineering students as part of the Ontario Society of Professional Engineer partnership with Specialist Turn in English in Ontario into IBM. And I failed because we hit the IBM internal process wall. And even though I had senior manager approval to do it, I could not get it through HR, even though we already had a formal IBM partnership with Specialist Turn. There were just so many boundaries that I could not get it through. And I was very sad because they were particularly excited because I'm a professional engineer in OSPE and I already mentor engineering students. And as autistic myself, I was going to be their manager. And so there was all the pieces lined up.
Yeah.
And just things out of my control in IBM's HR structure scuttled the whole thing. I love the program. I think it's great. There are systemic boundaries.
Yeah. So there's much more to be addressed on that front.
I'm so glad there are organizations like that doing the work, and hopefully it catches on. The other thing of the day that we have is an article from Forbes called How to Build an Inclusive Recruitment Process That Supports Neurodiversity in the Workplace. So they have a couple of suggestions for how to recruit talents that from neurodivergent folks. Job ads being more inclusive, removing language like team player that might be off-putting, or make us eliminate ourselves.
And hypocritical. Sorry, tangent.
But I feel like we often will read a job interview, and if there's one qualification we don't think we meet, we will eliminate ourselves. Other people will just apply even if they don't have half the qualifications. It's one of those like black and white ways of thinking, right?
100%.
Talks about like the font being neurodivergent friendly, restructuring the interview, giving the questions to everyone, checking what people prefer, whether it's Zoom, in-person, phone, some sort of task. I do like the suggestion of work sample tests, because then you can actually demonstrate kind of what role-specific tasks and what you can do. Let's see, what else did they say? Not doing things like group interviews or things where you're having them to display skills that aren't necessary for the job, like having them do a presentation if that's not part of the job. Asking for feedback as well. Anyway, so those were some of the suggestions in this article. And I'm very curious, like, what do you think makes for an interview that is neurodivergent friendly?
I'm going to do the thing that I tend to do when I sit on panels and stuff like this, which is to give a completely unexpected answer.
I love it.
None of those things, because I feel like those things create a checklist that becomes a fait accompli. The biggest problem I see with interviews is the hiring managers themselves, and often HR, but usually hiring managers, often don't even know what they want. So forget actually getting to the point of assessing whether they're good for the job. Can you even say upfront what is actually required for the job? So I coach students now. It's not just do you meet the requirements of the job specification, 60% or 70% still apply. It's 80% of postings in general are made up. They're copy pasted from a previous posting. And once you get to the actual job, then they'll decide what happens. So I'll tell you what I do when I interview. And by the way, my peers, and I'm IBM interviewing certified, I've done all the research, I've done all this stuff, and neurodivergent folk have told me as feedback when I seek feedback that they're very comfortable working with me. What I do is I take all of that formulated stuff and I throw it out the window, and I do informal coffee chats. You can learn more about what a person can do in an informal coffee chat by making them comfortable, by not doing any formalized assessment, and really assess their potential for success than with any process. I don't care how you do it. No matter what process you pick, it will favor a group that's optimized for that process, whatever that group is. And because neurodiversity is about diversity, the point is that it will never capture everybody. And so I hate the idea of coming up with any unique process. What I want is no process and dynamic adaptability. So let me give you a perfect example. I was interviewing a student many years ago, and we just went to her coffee. I went to the university and we met in the commons in the university and drinking Tim Hortons. And she's like, an interview at my university? I'm like, yeah, you don't need to come out to my office. Who cares? You know, like, oh, okay. And we're chatting. I said, hey, so what do you do for fun? And she's like, I'm like, no, it's safe. It's okay. She's like, I like video games. And like actually cringing. I'm like, super, that's amazing. Here's what video games teach you. Harvard Business Review tells that here's all the leadership skills that you learn in video games. If you can solve that video game, what are your favorites? Oh, well, I like this one and this one and this one. Oh, okay. So you're good at this and you're good at this and you're good at this. And she's like, I never thought of it that way, but I know you are. Okay. Yeah. And then the next thing I said is, if you have a problem that you know nothing about, nothing, what's the first thing you do? And she looks at me and she's like, I go to Google? And I'm like, yes, perfect, excellent, great answer. And she's like, but we were always told that Googling is bad. And I'm like, that's bullshit. Of course I want you to go Google it. Go and learn what you can about
medical symptoms. Don't Google your medical symptoms.
Well, honestly, though, Googling well is a skill.
It really is. No, but for real, it actually is. And if we get into more detail on this tangent, I start talking about the skill of learning to learn. Meta learning is its own skill. And it's one of the skills I value the most when I'm hiring, because I don't care what you know today. I care about your ability to learn dynamically. And again, this isn't just Mekki talking out of his ass. Research after research has said that that's what determines, especially in technology companies where the technology is continuously changing, the success of the employee.
Yeah.
This person I hired into a tiny little job. She worked for me for 12 months. She then left, worked another department of the same organization, and met with me for coffee, just as mentioned. And she said, it's night and day working for you versus working for these people. I'm useless over there. Whereas look at all what we accomplished in your team. She then went and got hired by Google, and then got hired by Twitch, and now works for Uber. Top performer, senior manager now. Because those are the things that predict success and capability. No one else in any of the other interviews there will give her the time of day. It's really, really sad. And she wrote to me a few years ago and said, if you hadn't given me that job, like I never would have had my career. I'm like, but everybody needs this. And it's not specific to neurodivergent people. So again, when I talk about neuroplurality, I want this to be a deliberate process at all levels of the organization. And when I interview for executive roles, I constantly get the following answer. And I put this in my latest article. You're really good at what you do. You're very capable. You're creating a ton of value for the organization. And our organization needs more people like you, just not on my team. It's a form of internal NIMBYism that nobody wants to be the one who's breaking the mold. And that's a really hard answer to hear once, but it's a much harder answer to hear 50 times. Because it's like, okay, well, who's going to do that? Well, they only create the positions that are pigeonholed for specific things. So I'm a guy who has only ever gotten roles that were created for me. When roles are created for me with the description written around my strengths, I blow the value out of the water. And this is true for a lot of people. So she said to me, this person I interviewed, what am I going to do? And I said, what do you want to do? She said, well, I want to do this, this, this. Great, that's your job. And she kicked ass at it.
Yeah.
Why don't we allow that more? Why do we start with the rigid box and try to cram people in it? It makes no sense at face value. And yet it's not just the norm. We stubbornly refuse to conceptualize anything else as remotely acceptable.
Yeah.
That's the problem. That's the problem in the workplace. It's the problem in education. It's the problem all around in our
It's the problem in the world.
Yeah.
It's very human, and that's why it's so intractable.
Yeah.
It's really, really hard problem.
And it's across countries and cultures.
Yes. And there's often cultural element overlap, but it's not the cause. It's an intersectionality of sorts.
Yeah. So we are just about where we need to wrap up. So I think it is time for Kara to go off on a complete tangent.
Yes. So yeah, exactly. We have something in common. We are both cat lovers. Now, I'm always curious to learn and then to have a little rant about why.
I'm out the door here.
Why do you like cats?
I, like most autistic people, cringe at autistic representations. Many years ago, a friend said to me, oh my God, you're going to love Big Bang Theory because it's all about ones of you. And I went and watched it and I'm like, that's laughing at, not laughing with. That's not funny. And a lot of people don't understand why it's not funny. Because we're the punchline. We're not included in the joke. So generally, I find Big Bang Theory uncomfortable, although it does have some cute references that I like. Right? One of the things I think they got right is the stereotypical of the main characters bonding with his cat as a child. And that the bond he had with his cat was as real, if not more real, than a bond with a human. Yes. And we see when you do measures of empathy and connection with autistic people that we are more likely to bond with non-humans in some cases because it's safer. And it's really fascinating that it's not just cats. It actually applies to inanimate objects as well. And it sometimes feeds into our autistic special interests. I found at a very young age, I never had cats growing up, I never had animals growing up because my mother didn't want to deal with it, that every time I visited a friend's house who had an animal, I was just drawn to them. And there was a certain peace and comfort and communication. I was blinking in communications to cats the way cats do body language before I knew what I was doing because it was intuitive. I have now since done training on cat body language training. I work with feral cats, spay, neuter, vaccinate. I've worked with aggressive cats. I've worked all these different things. And I have a dear friend who I would say is autistic, who may not self-identify, who specialized in the exact same thing with exotic birds and parrots and worked with traumatized animals that were smuggled out of countries to relearn to be comfortable with humans. That same intuitive connection with the animal. I think it's something that it's just a trait of many of us. And I always had that connection with the cats. So I always wanted cats. I always wanted to live with cats. And as soon as I got my first independent house, when I moved out with my parents, the first thing was cat. And now I have 6 of them in the house.
Oh,
so.
Wow.
I love that you said that it applies to not just cats. It's also other animals and even inanimate objects. A client of mine told me a really funny story. She was visiting a zoo with her school, and one of the things they did there was, they have this fun experiment that requires a brave student. So they put a heart rate monitor on, and then you're supposed to hold a snake and then a tarantula.
Oh my gosh.
And of course, the expectation is that the heart rate is going to go up.
Yeah.
She volunteered for this, and they didn't really know what to say to the class because her heart rate went down. So
I love that.
Yeah.
And so there's like this intuitive bond that we create with animals. And I will say, for me, with the tarantula, it would have definitely gone up. They would have not gotten it near me. But other than that, I find that it applies to so many of us.
It does. I've had students who, like, we talk about how they use their animals for self-care and that non-judgmental relationship, feeling truly seen and heard. Our animals can do that. My animal, so I currently have 2 cats. The maximum I've had at one time is 3. But when I come home and I just need downtime from having peopling all day, it's just, they bring me into the present.
100%.
They model how to take a break. But they also, so when I also love dogs, but I don't think I want a dog. They have too much energy sometimes. They can get overwhelming. And a dog, in general, again, generalization, dogs love everyone indiscriminately. When you have earned the affection of a cat, when that cat comes up with you, it is the best feeling in the world. They don't just act that way with everyone. You have earned that. That relationship. So they remind me so much more of humans in their personalities and the differences that they have, in how they have very clear boundaries.
And one slight difference there with the boundaries, they're consistent.
Yes.
They can only be what their nature is. They are never anything else. Whereas humans are inconsistent, and that can be frustrating for autistic folk.
Yes.
Very hard to learn.
And same with dogs, can be a little inconsistent too. And and cats, they are predictable. They fill me with a sense of peace. I love my cats.
Me too. I feel exactly the same. I love that. Talking about the pathologies we were earlier about certain executive leadership narcissistic traits, studies have shown that, not to take a big dig at dog people, but on average, dog people are looking to be worshipped without having to have any effort. Whereas cat people want to earn that affection. And you said that word, earn that affection. Dog people want to be able to violate boundaries as part of their authority. Cat people respect boundaries and understand how to set them and divide them. On average, it's not a huge thing, but it is generalization. It's very interesting research.
That is very, very interesting, and not what my experience is, but there's also in research, there's how do you measure these things?
Of course.
But yeah, I would say as someone who grew up with dogs, that for me, I would say the work aspect, I would rather have a cat.
Okay, that's also fair.
Because the you have the companionship and that, but there's much less pressure to go out and walk when it's cold. Which is one of my major things. I'm not a fan of walkies when it's cold.
No. Although it's boiling here right now in Toronto. Well, actually, it's nice outside, but my apartment, they don't turn on the AC until the middle of May, and it's been at least 30 degrees the last few days. So I'm you can see how flushed I am. I'm boiling. I would love to walk outside in the cold with a dog right now. That's all.
That's fair. No, but as someone who grew up with dogs, I found it very difficult to readjust to the body language of cats.
Very different.
Until I had learned something, because I only had dogs around me, so I didn't have the knowledge of how the body language was different. And I had an early experience with some family friends that had a cat, but it was the least social cat ever.
No.
And I should say, in fairness to dog people, it's entirely possible to have healthy relationships with dogs.
Of
And
course.
you often see the reflection of the human behavior in the animal. And so there are bad cat people who create bad personality cats. One of the things we've learned in ailurophile research here in University of Guelph, in Canada, we have one of the most foremost veterinary research departments in the world. And they've discovered that cats need to grow up in pairs, a minimum of pairs, and separating kittens to be alone before the age of 6 months leads them to be assholes later in life, to use that form. And so now a lot of adoption groups will only allow kittens to be adopted in pairs or more for exactly that reason. The same is true with dogs. We'll find the people who treat them inappropriately, the dogs are inconsistent and more likely to bite, etc. But the people who demonstrate good boundaries and respect, the dogs will be healthier. And so it's definitely not uniform, one way or the other.
Like
And you have to be a good human. It's like people, exactly.
Isn't.
Yeah.
And I actually think that there are, both with cats and dogs, I know that we're only talking cats and dogs right now, but with both species, there's such a difference between the breeds in the kind of personality that you can generally expect them to have.
Totally. My 6 cats are totally different, remarkably so.
Yeah.
We should do another episode just on cats sometime.
Sure, I'm game. The Ailurophile podcast.
Yes, exactly.
See, I won't be able to participate much because
Sure you can. No, dogs is fine. Dogs are just large cats, as I like to say.
We'll do it when you're on mat leave, Maya. When you're on mat leave, I'll have a cat.
No, we just had a family dog here for almost 2 weeks, and she doesn't bond with men as much. But the thing is, my husband has some kind of magic touch when it comes to dogs.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how. I've always grown up with dogs. He's not even an animal lover person. He's not. He doesn't really care that much.
He's allowed to be wrong. It's okay.
It's okay. But he has some kind of a magic touch with them. And I think there's something in his consistency that really makes dogs feel safe.
Predictability, yes.
Yeah. And I'm, slightly more anxious. I say slightly. I have generalized anxiety disorder. Hi.
Hi.
And also I can't do the long walks because I have crappy feet. My feet are bad. It's a thing. And so I can do all the feeding and I can do playing and I can do all of those things. But all of that socializing that happens during a walk, that happens with my husband. And this dog, who is generally not as good with men as she is with women, by the end of those 10 days that we had her, she would be on the couch in my husband's office all day long. And she would come in to say hi.
Yeah.
She started being with me and then she left.
Love it. My wife and I have a similar relationship with our different cats. Same thing.
But I also know that some people take their cats for walks.
You have to train them very young to do it. That's the trick, or certain specific breeds.
Yeah. But I also think that there's something in that appeals to me because the way that we keep outdoors cats puts them in a lot of danger.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
So what's your take on that?
So that's a great question. And it is very regionalized. So I will speak to Canada. The safest thing for a cat is to be indoors, and it is safe and healthy. Cats can have perfectly fulfilling lives indoors. They don't need a lot of space, so long as they have clean litter box, food, water, and human companionships, etc., they're good.
Stimulation,
exactly. That being said, people will choose to let their cats out, and in order of least worst, it's do an isolated catio, which is they're going outside, but it's restricted. Put them out on a leash with an anchored point or something like that. For all cats, make sure they have all their vaccines, rabies, that they're spayed and neutered, and microchipped, so that if somehow they do get away. So in Canada, if any animal is picked up anywhere, the first thing is we scan their microchips to see, and it just identifies them, returns them. For feral cats, it's a little bit different because feral cats, by definition, are outside living cats. And what's interesting about them is the feral cat programs are substitutes to mass euthanasia. And so it used to be we just grabbed them all up, we euthanized them 10, 15 years ago. Now we've accepted that we can have what's known as community cats, which are cats that can live healthily in the environment like other wild animals, but they're bridged. We provide them food, we provide them shelter, we provide them medical care. And the humans that care for them, who are often autistic, then get the value of those cats without all the social sanctions of, you're causing dirt and all this stuff. And so Toronto passed laws about 15 years ago to support that. And those cats have a temperament such that they probably can't live indoors. And we see that each new generation born outside will be less likely to be socializable, and it becomes difficult. And so spay neuter, eventually we lower the population without having to euthanize, and that works very well. So in those situations, same thing. What can you do? Spay neuter, vaccinate, monitor, give regular food and water, and you will double their lifespan. But that doubled lifespan outside is still half of the indoor lifespan. So untreated, untaken care of ferals have 1/4 the lifespan of taking care of indoor cats. And that's very, very difficult. So you want to try and keep that separation as much as possible. The last one is, if you do let your cats out without a leash, without a catio, etc., try to keep it as far from roads as possible, because vehicles are the #1 cause of death for cats. So actually, I allow my cats to roam outside unsupervised because I live in a townhouse complex where the nearest road is 50 meters away, and my cats don't go anywhere near the road, and they have a safe area that they can be outside, but really inside a complex to play. And the condo board loves it because they keep the mouse population down. And, all the neighbors know them. They walk by, hi, Caddy, how's it going? And they're sort of like, they're community cats, but at the end of the night, they all walk back into my house. Everybody knows they have collars, they have microchips, etc. And feral cats, we ear tip. So that's a sign to animal services that, hey, that cat that's difficult, you're never going to catch it. You don't have to worry about it. It has a tiny ear tip. That means it's already spayed, neutered, vaccinated, and someone's caring for it. So leave it alone. So animal services won't pick up any cats with an ear tip. They just leave them alone. And that prevents accidental euthanasia and all these other things. So there are great organizations that have researched this. In the US, it's Alley Cat Allies, that some old lady left a huge endowment at her death to create this foundation that basically runs this type of training for all of North America. And in Europe and other places, it varies. You'll see in the Middle East that cats are treated not quite as sacred as, say, Indian cows, but
Turkey does a great job with street cats.
Turkey is great. And there's a weird middle ground. They're doing better. They allow them in mosques and they're respect, etc. But there's still not enough spay neutering and vaccination. It's a weird mix. But of course, that's because of the story of the Prophet Muhammad, who had the cat Misha, who saved them from a snake. And so there's sort of this tradition about these things in different cultures where a Muslim, you show respect to the cat, etc.
Natural relationship. Yeah.
Yes. Whereas in Central America, cats are considered pests like rats, and they are to be eradicated because they're out of control and they destroy places and whatever. And in fact, some places eat cats. We eat every animal around the world because they're considered a sustainable meat supply because they reproduce so quickly. And while that makes us cringe, well, that's a cultural variance. Yeah.
That was wonderful. Oh, what a great tangent.
What a great tangent. I'm telling you, ailurophile podcast. I'll be there.
All right. Sounds good.
All right. So that special episode will be around someday. And for the ones who want it. Yeah.
Until then, well, thank you so much for joining us, Mekki, and a lot of food for thought. And I really appreciated all of your insights on neuroplurality.
I appreciate that you guys are doing this work and setting up these conversations. So thank you for that. I can imagine your audience appreciates all of the interesting things you bring to light. And I'm going to post this in Neurodiversity IBM community and have them spread it all around. And so.
Excellent.
That sounds wonderful. Well, these conversations wouldn't be possible without, experts like you joining us and talking about their field. So we appreciate your time so much. Thank you for making today even possible and for teaching us so much today.
Thank you for making rants socially acceptable.
Hey, all the time. All right, well, I guess that's it, folks. Follow us on social media. I'm at Dr. Kara Diamond. Maya?
I'm at Maya Todale, or an autistic psychologist.
And Mekki, we will post yours. Are there any you want to share?
On Twitter at MEKONTech, MEKONTEK. I mostly talk about technology and that area and business and stuff like that. And then on LinkedIn, Mekki M, MEKKIM. Everybody's welcome to reach out.
Very wonderful.
See you later.
Cool. See you guys. Autistic tidbits and tangents.